The classroom on the Vera Galactic Command Academy station had gone still. Kale Rin, the Academy's top-ranked cadet, leaned back in his seat with a faint smile and asked the question everyone had been thinking since the human first walked in. "So Vance. Confirmed kills. What's the number?" A few cadets laughed. Elias Vance did not. He simply turned his head, met Kale's eyes, and answered in a voice that carried no anger and no performance at all. "Do you want the number in my public record," he said, "or the one Earth sealed?" The laughter stopped. Admiral Serac, who had been observing quietly from the back of the room, straightened. He did not smile. He walked to the console, entered his authorization and pulled up the file himself. The screen lit up in front of the entire class. Confirmed, 247. Then, beneath it, more lines began to load, one after another, until they stopped. Access restricted. Earth command authorization required. Serac stared at the screen for a long moment. In 30 years of command, he had never once been denied access to a cadet's file inside his own academy. He looked back at Elias, who had already returned his attention to the datapad in front of him, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. 3 weeks earlier, Elias Vance had walked through the main gate of the Vera Galactic Command Academy carrying a single bag and no expectations. He was 34 years old, which made him nearly a decade older than most of the cadets around him. Most of them had spent their entire lives training for this moment, moving through academy prep schools and cadet programs since childhood. Elias had not. He was the first human ever admitted to the program, and within a day the assumption had already formed around him without anyone needing to say it out loud. Humanity was new to the coalition. Untested. Politically useful, perhaps, but militarily unproven. Most of the cadets decided Elias was here because someone back on Earth wanted a symbolic presence at the academy, not because he had earned his place through merit. He carried no notable family name. He did not speak of his service record. He answered questions about himself with short, plain sentences and then let the conversation move on. Kale Rin, the top-ranked cadet in his year, decided early on that Elias confirmed everything he already believed about humans. Kale had grown up hearing stories about Earth's chaotic entry into galactic affairs, and to him, a quiet older man who said almost nothing about himself was simply further proof that humanity had been overhyped by people who did not know any better. He was not cruel about it. He simply treated Elias the way a confident young officer treats someone he assumes has nothing to teach him. Lyra Voss saw it differently, though she could not yet explain why. She noticed it first during a routine tour of the academy's lower levels. While the other cadets followed the guide without much thought, Elias's eyes moved constantly, checking exits, doorways, and the position of every person in the room. It looked less like curiosity and more like habit. A few days later, during a scheduled maintenance drill, the power flickered in one of the training halls seconds before the instructors announced it. Elias had already glanced toward the door before the lights even dimmed. When she asked him about it afterward, he only shrugged and said that a person got used to noticing certain things after enough time in the field. He did not elaborate and she did not push. During combat simulations the pattern continued. Younger cadets, even talented ones, tended to react to danger the way students react to a difficult exam, with visible tension and hurried decisions. Elias moved through the same simulations with an unusual, steady calm, as though the exercise were simply another task to complete rather than a test to survive. He rarely spoke during these sessions unless someone needed help, and when a weaker cadet struggled with equipment or positioning, Elias would quietly correct them without drawing attention to it. He never asked for credit. Lyra began to suspect that the quiet cadet everyone dismissed understood something about real danger that the rest of them had only studied in theory. That was the version of Elias the Academy thought it understood, right up until the moment Kale asked his question in the middle of a lecture on combat statistics, and the number 247 appeared on the screen for the entire class to see. Admiral Serac did not lower the file once the restriction locked him out. He kept searching, scrolling through whatever fragments of the record had not been sealed, until a single operation name surfaced on its own, untouched by the classification around it. Meridian. It was only one word, but Serac's posture changed the moment he read it. Lyra noticed it immediately, and so did several other cadets sitting close enough to see his face. Whatever that name meant to him, it clearly was not something he associated with an ordinary training exercise or a minor skirmish buried in old coalition archives. He looked up from the screen and studied Elias for a long moment before he spoke. "You were there?" he said. It was not really a question. "Yes, sir," Elias answered. "I was there." He said it the same way he said everything else, without weight or performance, but the room did not take it that way. Kale's earlier smile was long gone. Lyra found herself watching Elias with a different kind of attention now, the sense settling over her that the 247 confirmed kills sitting on that screen might be the least important number hidden somewhere inside his record. The official Coalition archives had almost nothing to say about Meridian, and what little they did say made it sound like a footnote rather than a battle. Meridian had been a small human frontier colony, established on the edge of contested space during Earth's early expansion, years before the Coalition had fully recognized humanity as a member species. According to the archived summary, the colony was attacked during a regional conflict that most of the wider galaxy had already forgotten. The record stated that Meridian fell within hours, and that evacuation had become impossible once the enemy severed the colony's main defensive line. That was the entire official account. One paragraph, a handful of coordinates and a closed file. Admiral Serac read it twice before looking up from his desk, where he had summoned Elias privately rather than continue the conversation in front of the class. Lyra was there as well, though not by any special arrangement. She had been assigned earlier that week to assist with the Academy's ongoing archive review, a routine cadet duty that had suddenly become far less routine once Serac began pulling records related to Meridian. The report says the colony fell within hours, Serac said. It does not explain how a single soldier accumulated 247 confirmed engagements in an operation that supposedly ended that quickly. Elias's expression did not change, but something in his voice grew quieter. Because it didn't end in hours, sir, he said. The colony's official defense ended in hours. What happened afterward wasn't in any defense plan. Serac leaned back slightly, waiting. Elias explained it the way a man explains something he has repeated to himself many times, carefully and without embellishment. When Meridian's perimeter collapsed, Earth Command had ordered an emergency evacuation for every unit still able to reach the extraction point. Most of his unit made it. Then what took so long? Serac asked. The extraction point wasn't the problem, sir, Elias said. Time was. Once the perimeter fell, we weren't fighting a battle anymore. We were fighting a clock, and it kept running out on people who couldn't move fast enough. His number, he said, had not come from a single desperate battle. It had come from days spread across a retreat that never followed any clean military plan, moving through hostile territory with an enemy that kept finding them. Each encounter had been smaller than the cadets probably imagined, brief and ugly rather than heroic, the kind of fighting that happens when there is no good option left and someone still has to make a decision. Lyra had been listening without interrupting, but she finally asked the question that had been sitting in the room since Serac first pulled up the file. If your unit reached the extraction point, she said, why weren't you on the transport? For the first time since she had met him, Elias hesitated. The transport was full, he said. Serac's eyes narrowed slightly, sensing there was more beneath the simple answer, and there was. There were still people outside the perimeter, Elias continued. Colonists, medical staff. A few wounded soldiers who couldn't move fast enough to make the original evacuation window. Command had already written them off by the time the last transport was loading. He said it plainly, the same way he described everything, but the weight of it settled differently this time. Lyra realized she was no longer looking at a puzzle to solve. She was looking at a decision Elias had made years ago that had clearly never stopped costing him something. So you stayed, Serac said. I stayed, Elias said. I wasn't the only one. A handful of us did. It wasn't an order. Command had already moved on. As far as anyone back home knew, everyone left outside that perimeter was already gone. Serac studied him for a long moment, the restricted file still glowing faintly on the desk between them. In 3 decades of service he had read hundreds of combat records, and most of them followed a familiar shape. An objective, a fight, a result. This was different. Whatever happened next at Meridian had clearly not followed a plan at all, and the 247 number on that screen suddenly felt less like an achievement and more like the visible edge of something much larger still buried beneath the classification. How many people were still out there? Serac asked. Elias was quiet for a moment before he answered. More than I expected to find alive, he said. That's as much as I can tell you without the rest of the file, sir. Serac sat back, his expression unreadable, and reached for his console again. The restriction remained in place, refusing him anything beyond what had already surfaced. He would need direct authorization from Earth Command itself to see the rest, and that was not something granted quickly, even to an Academy commandant. Lyra watched Elias as the conversation ended, noticing the way he did not seem relieved to have shared even this much. If anything, he looked like a man who had opened a door he generally preferred to keep closed, and was already waiting for the moment he could close it again. Whatever happened after that transport left without him, she understood now that it had shaped every quiet, careful habit she had noticed in him since the day he arrived. The question was no longer whether Elias Vance had done something remarkable at Meridian. The question was how he had survived doing it, and what exactly he had been protecting when he chose to stay. Serac did not press for more details that day. He seemed to understand, in the way that experienced commanders often do, that some information could not be pulled out of a man faster than he was willing to give it. Instead, he requested a formal review authorization from Earth Command, citing the Academy's need to understand the full record of a currently enrolled cadet. It was a reasonable request. It still took 3 days for Earth to respond, and when they did, the authorization came with restrictions of its own. What finally unlocked was not the complete file. It was enough. Earth Command had released a defined portion of the Meridian record, specific enough that Serac could now see the shape of the operation, though not everything inside it. Elias made that distinction clear before he said anything else. "I can speak to what's on that screen now, sir," he said. "Not past that." "Same as before." Serac nodded once, accepting the boundary without argument, and the conversation continued from there. Elias, Serac, and Lyra sat together again in the same quiet office, and this time the screen showed considerably more than a single operation name. The numbers behind Meridian were larger and more complicated than anyone in that room had expected, and they told a very different story than the one the wider galaxy remembered. The colony's defensive line had held just long enough for most of Meridian's population to reach the evacuation zone. What the official coalition summary never mentioned was the several hundred people who never made it that far. Medical staff still treating the wounded when the perimeter collapsed. Families caught on the far side of the colony when communications went down. A group of defenders too injured to move at evacuation speed. By the time the last transport lifted off, Earth Command's official position was that anyone still outside the extraction zone was already lost. Elias did not accept that position, and neither had the small group of soldiers who chose to stay with him. "There were maybe 30 of us who stayed," he said. "Some wounded ourselves. No senior officers left by the second day. Command structure back home had already written the operation as concluded." "So who was in charge?" Lyra asked. Elias was quiet for a moment. "Nobody at first," he said. "Then, somehow it ended up being me." He did not say it with pride. If anything, his voice grew more careful as he continued, the way a man speaks when he is choosing each word to avoid sounding like something he was not. He explained that leading a scattered group of survivors through hostile territory had very little in common with anything taught in a classroom. There was no clear terrain advantage, no reliable supply line, and no communication with anyone who could send help. What there was, instead, was a moving column of frightened, wounded, and exhausted people who needed someone to make decisions faster than the danger around them changed. Food became a daily calculation. Distance became the only real strategy, since staying in one place too long meant discovery. The wounded slowed everything down, and leaving them behind was never discussed as an option. Enemy patrols moved through the region constantly, sometimes passing close enough that the column had to stay motionless for hours at a time. Every confirmed engagement in Elias's official record, every one of the 247, had happened during that slow, grinding movement toward anywhere that still counted as safe. "Every one of those numbers happened because someone behind me couldn't defend themselves," Elias said. "That's not heroism. That's just what happens when you're the only person standing between people and something worse." Serac had been silent for most of this, but his expression had grown steadily more serious. He scrolled further into the newly unlocked file, searching for the operation's official conclusion, the part that should have explained how the story ended. What he found instead raised a new question entirely. According to the record, the survivor column had ultimately been presumed destroyed. There was no confirmed recovery listed. No official rescue. No closing report describing how any of them made it home. And yet Elias Vance was sitting in that room. Serac looked up from the screen, his voice quieter now. "The file says your column was presumed lost," he said. "There's no recovery listed here at all." "There wouldn't be," Elias said. "Not in anything you have access to." Serac studied him for a long moment before turning back to the console. He entered a second authorization request, this one specifically targeting whatever event had actually ended the operation, rather than the operation itself. It took longer this time, long enough that Lyra thought the request might simply be denied again. Instead, a single new file fragment appeared on the screen, still heavily restricted, but showing just enough to read its heading. Meridian Recovery Event. Classification Level Black. Beneath it was a single number with no explanation attached. 1204. Nobody in the room spoke for a moment. Lyra looked at the number, then at Elias, searching his face for some reaction that would explain what it meant. He offered none. If anything, he looked like a man who had been waiting a long time for someone else to finally see it, without yet being ready to explain it himself. Serac finally broke the silence. "What is this number, Cadet Vance?" Elias looked at the screen for a long moment before answering, and something in his face shifted, quiet and controlled but unmistakable. "That's still sealed, sir," he said. "I'm not authorized to say what it means." "Not yet." He did not look away from the number as he said it. It was, Lyra realized, the first time since she had known him that Elias Vance had looked less than completely calm. The alarms began less than 2 days later, in the middle of an ordinary evening on the Academy station. There was no dramatic build-up. One moment, the corridors were filled with the usual noise of cadets moving between classes and quarters. The next, the lighting dimmed to a deep amber, and a calm automated voice announced a station-wide security breach, followed almost immediately by the far more unsettling sound of the voice repeating itself, as though the system itself was uncertain how serious the situation truly was. A group of armed intruders, later identified as a splinter faction with no clear allegiance to any recognized coalition government, had exploited a maintenance corridor during a scheduled systems update and gained access to one of the station's lower decks. Academy security had not expected an attack of this kind, and the initial response reflected it. Power failed across several sections almost immediately, cutting off half the residential decks from command, and communications dissolved into intermittent static within minutes. Lyra was in a common study area with several other cadets, including Cale, when the lights dimmed and the alarm sounded for the second time. For a moment, nobody moved. It was the kind of pause that happens when people have trained for emergencies in theory but have never actually lived through one. Cale recovered first, at least outwardly. He began reciting the standard lockdown protocol from memory, directing cadets toward the nearest designated shelter point exactly as their training required. It was not bad instinct. It was simply built for a different kind of emergency, one where command remained intact and information kept flowing. Neither of those things was true anymore. The comm channel Cale tried to reach for updates returned only broken fragments of chatter, and the shelter point he named turned out to be sealed behind a section of corridor that had already lost power. Elias had been quiet since the alarm started, listening more than speaking, but something in his posture had changed the moment the second alert sounded. Lyra recognized it before she understood why. It was the same stillness she had noticed weeks earlier during simulations, except now there was nothing simulated about it. "This isn't matching the drill," he said quietly, mostly to himself. Cale turned toward him, some of his earlier confidence still intact. "It's a lockdown, Vance. We follow protocol." "Protocol assumes command still has the full picture," Elias said. "They don't. Not down here. Not yet." He did not argue further. Instead, he began moving toward the cadets nearest the failed corridor, checking who was there and who was missing, his questions short and specific. Which quarters were occupied? Which students had late lab sessions? Whether anyone had seen the maintenance crew scheduled for that deck. Lyra found herself answering before she had decided to help him, simply because the questions demanded immediate, useful answers rather than reassurance. It was, she realized later, exactly what he had described about Meridian. Not a plan built in advance, but a series of decisions made quickly, based on whatever was actually true in front of him rather than what training assumed should be true. Cale watched this for a moment, clearly torn between the protocol he trusted and the quiet, immediate competence unfolding in front of him. He was not humiliated by it, not exactly. He looked more like a man realizing that a subject he had studied for years was suddenly being handled by someone who had lived it instead. "You think this is like Meridian?" Cale said, not quite a question. "I think there are civilians and students somewhere on this station who don't know if anyone is coming for them," Elias said. "That part's the same no matter what we call it." He did not raise his voice as he organized the cadets nearby into smaller groups, assigning simple, achievable tasks rather than ambitious ones. 2 cadets to check the residential corridor for anyone trapped behind the failed door. 1 cadet to keep attempting contact with Academy security using whatever channel still occasionally connected. Lyra stayed close to him, partly to help and partly because she wanted to understand how he was reading a situation that felt like chaos to everyone else. Cale hesitated only a moment longer before falling in as well, taking a task without complaint for the first time since Elias had arrived at the Academy. It was not command in the way the Academy taught it, with clear rank and formal authority. It was something quieter, built from experience rather than position, and the cadets around him respected it without needing to be told to. Elias did not know yet how far the breach extended, or how many people remained cut off in the section still without power. What he did know, watching the amber emergency lighting flicker along the corridor ahead of them, was that the shape of this crisis was uncomfortably familiar. Limited information. People trapped behind failures no one had planned for. No guarantee that help was coming in time. The last time he had faced something built this way, it had taken days, and it had cost more than the official record would ever say. This time he told himself he intended to move faster. Within the hour, Elias had turned a handful of frightened cadets into something resembling a functioning unit, though he never once used that word out loud. He kept the task small and specific and he kept moving. His priorities surprised everyone but Lyra. When a group of younger cadets reported hostile movement 2 corridors over, Elias did not lead anyone toward it. Instead, he redirected effort toward a sealed lab section where a dozen students had been trapped since the power failure, working with what tools they had to free the door rather than chase the sound of danger. He avoided confrontation whenever possible, choosing longer, quieter routes through the station over faster ones that risked contact with the intruders. "We're not here to win a fight," he told Kale when the other cadet questioned the detour. "We're here to make sure everyone we can reach is still breathing when this is over." Kale did not argue. He had stopped doing that several hours ago. It was during the evacuation of the trapped lab students that the situation turned. A section of damaged flooring gave way beneath Kale as he helped guide the last student through a narrow maintenance gap, dropping him into a lower utility space with a fractured leg and no easy way back up. The path above him was structurally unstable, and the intruder's last known position placed them uncomfortably close to that exact corridor. One of the cadets, doing the math out loud without meaning to, said what everyone was thinking. Going back for Kale meant risking the group to save one person, in a section that might not hold long enough for anyone to return safely. Elias was already moving before the sentence finished. "Get everyone else to the rally point," he said. "I'm not leaving him down there." Lyra went with him, along with one cadet who refused to be sent away. The 3 of them reached the gap within minutes, working quickly to stabilize the broken section enough to lower a line down to Kale, who was conscious but pinned awkwardly against a support strut, unable to free his leg on his own. "You should have gone with the others," Kale said when Elias finally reached him. His voice was tight with pain, but there was no fear in it, only disbelief. This wasn't a good trade. "It's not a trade," Elias said, working to free the strut without shifting Kale's weight wrong. "You're not a number I'm deciding whether to accept." It was not a dramatic line. He said it the way he said most things, plainly and without performance, but it landed with more weight than anything Kale had heard from him since the classroom. For the first time, Kale understood, not in theory but in the moment itself, what the 247 number had actually represented. It had never been about how many enemies Elias was willing to fight. It was about the people he refused to leave behind, and how far he was willing to go to make sure the number of those left behind stayed at 0. They got Kale free and moving within minutes, supporting his weight between them as they made their way back toward the rally point. It was slower than Elias would have liked, but they reached the others without further incident, and for a moment, it felt as though the worst of it might be over. That relief did not last. One of the security cadets monitoring the last working comm channel reported that an entire residential section remained cut off, its emergency evacuation route sealed behind a damaged control junction that required someone physically present to override. Without it, dozens of students and staff still sheltering in that section would have no way out before the intruders finished clearing the lower decks. Someone would have to go back and manually restore that route, alone, with no guarantee the corridor leading to it was still clear. Elias looked toward the section on the map display, then toward the group around him, exhausted and already stretched thin from the last hour. Lyra saw the decision forming on his face before he said anything. "I know that junction," he said quietly. "I can reach it faster than anyone else here." Kale, still favoring his injured leg, looked at him with an expression that was no longer skepticism. "Then let us help you get there," he said. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Elias did not immediately refuse the offer. The corridor leading to the damaged control junction was quiet in the worst possible way, the kind of quiet that meant the intruders had already moved through or were still somewhere close enough to hear. Elias took point without needing to say so, with Kale limping but steady behind him and Lyra watching the side passages they passed. They reached the junction without contact, though twice Elias raised a hand and held them still while distant movement passed somewhere beyond the walls. Restoring the route took several tense minutes of manual override work, made harder by Kale's injured leg and the failing emergency lighting. Lyra kept watch at the corridor's mouth, and it was her warning, quiet and immediate, that gave them the few seconds needed to finish the override before a pair of intruders rounded the corner behind them. What followed was brief and controlled rather than heroic in the way the cadets might once have imagined. Elias moved the group into the narrow maintenance space beside the junction, using the terrain rather than confronting the intruders directly, buying just enough time for the restored route to activate and for the sealed section's alarm to shift from lockdown to clear. Coalition security forces, finally regaining control of the lower decks, intercepted the intruders in the corridor moments later. By the time full station lighting returned, the trapped residential section was already evacuating, and the threat that had gripped the academy for the better part of a night was over. 3 days passed before Admiral Serac called Elias, Lyra, and Kale back to his office. This time, Earth Command had granted full authorization. The restricted lines of the Meridian file finally opened completely, and Serac read through it once in silence before turning the screen so all 3 cadets could see it. "This is the number the galaxy remembers," Serac said, gesturing to the familiar figure at the top. "Confirmed, 247. It's the number that made you notorious the moment Kale asked about it in class." He scrolled down to the section that had remained sealed since the beginning, the Meridian Recovery Event, and let it load fully for the first time. 1,204. "That is not a kill count," Serac said quietly. "That is the number of civilians your column brought out alive. Colonists, medical staff, children. People Earth Command had already written off as lost before you and 30 others decided otherwise." Lyra felt something settle in her chest as the number finally made sense, not as a mystery to solve but as the answer she had been circling since the day Serac first opened that file. Kale said nothing for a long moment, staring at the screen the way a man stares at something that rearranges everything he thought he understood. "The file stayed classified for 2 reasons, Serac continued. "Part of it was strategic. The route your group used to escape exposed weaknesses Earth didn't want known. But the deeper reason was simpler. Command had already declared that operation a loss. Bringing back over 1,000 people they'd written off would have raised questions about decisions made at levels far above a single soldier. It was easier to seal the file than answer for it." Elias had said very little through all of this, his eyes fixed somewhere past the screen. "I didn't do it for the number," he said finally. "I don't think about 247. I think about the ones who didn't make it out. Those are the names I remember." Kale looked at him for a long moment, and when he spoke, there was none of the old confidence in his voice, only something quieter and more honest. "I asked you how many people you'd killed," he said. "That was never the right question." Elias didn't answer right away. He simply nodded once, the way a man accepts something true rather than something flattering, and let the silence hold what needed to be said. The academy returned to its normal rhythm within a week, though nothing about it felt entirely the same. Cadets still spoke about the night of the breach, but the conversation had shifted from the intruders to something quieter, harder to explain to anyone who had not been there when Serac opened that file. Kale found Elias alone in the training hall a few days later, running through the same simulation routines he always did, unhurried and precise. Kale's leg was still healing, and he moved carefully as he crossed the room, waiting until Elias noticed him before speaking. "I owe you an apology," Kale said. "Not for the question. For the way I asked it." Elias set down the equipment he had been checking and looked at him without judgment. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You asked what everyone wanted to know." "I asked how many people you'd killed," Kale said. "I never once asked how many you brought home. That should have been the first question, not the last one anyone thought to ask." Elias considered that for a moment, the way he considered most things, without rushing toward an answer that sounded good. "Most people ask the easier question first," he said. "The harder one usually costs more to answer." Kale didn't respond right away. It was, Lyra realized when she arrived a moment later, the first time she had seen him look at Elias without any trace of competition in his expression, only something closer to respect earned rather than assumed. Lyra had been present for the full unlocking of the Meridian file, and in the days since she had come to understand why Elias had never spoken of it voluntarily. It was not shame, and it was not modesty in the performative sense some cadets mistook it for. It was simply that the number the galaxy celebrated had never been the part that mattered to him, and correcting that story publicly would have meant explaining a version of himself he preferred to carry quietly instead. "You could have told everyone the truth the moment you got here," she said. "About the 1,200. It would have changed how people saw you immediately." "It would have," Elias agreed. "But then people would have respected the number instead of understanding what it cost." I'd rather they learn it slowly if they learn it at all. Admiral Serac summoned him one final time before the semester's academic cycle continued, offering what many cadets would have considered a rare honor, an accelerated placement track toward a command position, along with formal recognition for the Meridian Recovery event, now cleared by Earth Command for inclusion in his Academy service record. Elias declined the recognition, though not the training itself. "I didn't come here because I thought I already knew everything, sir," he said. "I came because next time, if there is a next time, I want to know enough to bring back more people than I did the last time." Serac studied him for a long moment, the same way he had the day the restricted file first appeared on that classroom screen, though the expression on his face now held something closer to quiet approval than suspicion. "Most soldiers who survive what you survived spend the rest of their career trying to be remembered for it," Serac said. "You spend yours trying to make sure it never has to happen the same way again." "That seems like the better use of it, sir," Elias said. The Academy's official records were updated later that month. The line that once read only confirmed, 247 remained unchanged and unhidden, exactly as it always had been. But beneath it, for the first time, a second line appeared, one that had waited years to be written. Meridian Recovery Event. 1,204 civilians returned alive. The galaxy had spent a long time remembering the number of enemies Elias Vance had defeated. It took considerably longer for it to learn the number of people who were still alive because he had refused to leave without them, and longer still for anyone to understand that, to him, it had never really been a choice at all. If stories like this remind you what humanity can be at its best, subscribe to Humanity's Armada. There are more stories waiting among the stars, and I'd be honored to have you with us for the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and never forget the people worth bringing home.